So, we began the Bible study tonight, and this is actually part 5 of lessons from the life of Joseph, the son of Jacob. It's really been an amazing study to me. I hope it has been to you as well. This remarkable man who became, and of course, we're really getting into that now, really became a mighty instrument in the hands of God. But he started out as born the 11th of 12 sons to his father Jacob, and of course, a very favored son. And I won't go through all of that again, but that, of course, brought about the jealousy of his brothers. They sold him as a slave down into Egypt. That was bad enough, but then he became a prisoner, and for about 13 years. Matter of fact, we can say that definitively because we know that from the Bible. From age 17 until age 30, he was either a servant slave in the household of Potiphar, where he began there in Egypt, and then later a prisoner in Egypt for those 13 years. God put him through a lot, but then he really gave him great favor, and we'll continue with that tonight. Now, I'm going to share my screen here this evening just a little bit. I'm going to use a few slides. I didn't at all last time. This time, though, I would like to use a few. Now, I realize not everyone has video. So, again, I'll just describe it, but I want to talk a little bit about the region again because up here in the land of Canaan, where Jacob and his 11 sons were, and we know that they were around Hebron down here, and then later they had their flocks up at Shechem. This was a wealthy household, and they were grazing their flocks over a large region, then on up at Dothan, and from there is where Joseph was sold as a slave all the way down to Egypt. And it's quite a distance here. It is quite a distance. So later on, when the brothers, and we're assuming they're still somewhere in this region, say around Hebron, I'll just assume that, when they go down to Egypt to get grain, they're traveling some 400 miles. This is quite a trip. But as we closed the study last time, people were coming also to get grain from Egypt from way down in the Arabian Peninsula. So this famine was impacting a big region. But for tonight, we're really going to be focused on the brothers coming from Canaan down into Egypt. By the way, this probably depicts something, and I want to note my source here. That's the professional thing to do. There's this website called Free Bible Images. And I'm using that a lot, and I think they're pretty accurate in a lot of their depictions here. So Joseph, at this point, by all appearance, manner, and even his language, remember he had spoken through an interpreter, even though he clearly understood the Hebrew language that his brothers were speaking, but he didn't let them know that. So even in language, by all appearances, he was an Egyptian. But we are very confident he had not adopted their religion. And that was quite a feat for him to stay faithful alone, we might say, down there in Egypt. Now, this storage of grain, you remember the interpretation of Pharaoh's dream about the 7 fat cows, the 7 lean cows, the 7 plump heads of grain, and the 7 shriveled heads of grain. And of course, Joseph immediately interpreted that dream, and he said there's going to be 7 years of plenty, bountiful harvests. And then there's going to be 7 years of severe famine, and he counseled them to prepare for that. Well, that worked out. I don't really believe it was self-seeking, but the Pharaoh immediately appoints Joseph to direct all of this. And they constructed huge grain storage facilities. And I think this is pretty accurate. You know, in that area, they wouldn't have had a lot of wood, but they had a lot. And later, you know, if you're studying in Exodus, the Bible reading program, the Egyptian, or excuse me, the Israelites, years and years later, were making bricks for the land of Egypt. Well, here, this is likely pretty close to what they were constructing as far as grain storage facilities. And then they were bringing in this grain from very bountiful harvests, which went on for 7 years. But then you have this abrupt, well, excuse me, I have one more picture here of how they were likely filling these. And I've also looked at other sources, and it shows exactly the same thing, or perhaps with slight differences. But they built these steps. You can see them here in at least three places, and they would physically carry the grain up and dump it in these, actually fill these silos, if you want to call them that. But I think it was actually a very efficient way to store grain. I'm sure there was some type of cover on these, and if you look up to the upper left, those of you with video, you can see those are actually covered. But then comes the lean years, and the famine was so severe. The soil, this is just a depiction, the soil was powder dry, it wasn't growing anything. You look at that cow with the ribs showing, gaunt. It's just, that this is exactly what Pharaoh saw in his dream. First, the seven fat, nice looking cows, and then he said it's, if you remember what we covered, seven of these cattle that he said looked worse than anything he had ever seen in Egypt. Well, this is likely what was going on, a pretty good depiction of that. And then they begin to unload the grain, if you will, or remove the grain from those storage facilities. And distribution of grain was not only made to the Egyptians, but to many, many other lands. And then I wanted to put this in because I don't want to go back to this, but we'll talk about this again tonight. That dream of 20 plus years earlier. Remember, Joseph was a slave and then a prisoner for 13 years. Then you add the 7 years of plenty, that is 20 years, plus a little bit. And they go down. That is Joseph's 10 brothers, excluding Benjamin, go down there to get grain on the first trip. And they are bowing before him. And then we're going to read again tonight where they do that once more. And that was the fulfillment of that dream that he had had. Remember, all the way back to the sheaves. His sheaves stood up, and their sheaves bowed down to his sheaf. Well, that happened exactly as he had dreamed, and God brought it to pass. So I'm going to break off there. I don't want to spend too much time with the slides, but I think those visuals are very helpful. So tonight, I'm going to resume where we left off last time, and that's chapter 42 of the book of Genesis. And we'll begin in the latter part of the chapter, verse 25. Verse 25, this is the brothers' first trip down to Egypt to get grain. And it is interesting, Joseph never reveals himself as being their brother on that first trip down there. So in verse 25, Joseph gave a command to fill their sacks with grain, to restore every man's money to his sack. Now, he's really being very generous and kind, but of course they don't know that. And not only that, he says he gave them provisions for the journey. That's what he did for them. Verse 26, so they loaded their donkeys with the grain and departed from there. And it appears like the grain was being doled out without them being there. This was strictly controlled. So the sacks were already filled and, if you will, tied up and closed when they received them back. So they depart. And verse 27, but as one of them opened his sack to give his donkey feed at the encampment, this is probably the first night out, he saw his money, and there it was in the mouth of his sack. So he said to his brothers, my money has been restored, and there it is in my sack. Then their hearts failed, or their hearts sank, and they were afraid, saying to one another, what is this that God has done to us? They're very fearful that they're being set up as thieves. And it is interesting, they're acknowledging God. What is this that God has done to us? I think they're beginning to see, and you remember what we covered late last time, they're being punished for what they did to their brother, but they still have no idea they were actually in his presence. So, verse 29, let's go on in verse 29. I'll read all the way through verse 34. Then they went to Jacob their father in the land of Canaan and told him all that had happened to them, saying, the man who was Lord of the land, and they recognized the position he had, Joseph, Lord of the land. Um, they said that the man who's Lord of the land spoke roughly to us or harshly, and he took us for spies of the country. But we said to him, we are honest men, we are not spies. We are 12 brothers, sons of our father. One is no more. Well, one is no more. They're talking of Joseph. They assume he's dead. And that they said the youngest is with our father this day in the land of Canaan. Then the man, the Lord of the country, said to us, by this I will know that you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers here with me. Take food for the famine of your households and be gone. Or, in other words, get going. And bring your youngest brother to me, so I shall know that you are not spies, but that you are honest men. I will grant your brother to you, and you may trade in the land. Now, he kept one of them behind, if you remember that. 10 went down, only 9 returned, because he had Simeon bound right before them all and kept him in Egypt uh, as his temporary slave. Now, verse 35, the account continues. Then it happened as they emptied their sacks. Now, apparently, the rest of them had not opened their sacks on the way, but now, back in Canaan, they do. Surprisingly, each man's bundle of money was in his sack. And when they and their father saw the bundles of money, they were afraid. Jacob, too, now is really troubled. Verse 36, and Jacob their father said to them, you have bereaved me. Joseph is no more. Simeon is no more. He's presuming he'll never see Simeon again. And now continue with me, and you want to take Benjamin. All these things are against me. This poor man, this aging patriarch, Jacob, sees a lot of trouble ahead. And indeed, that's the way it looks. It's exactly the way it looks. Now, in verse 37, Reuben spoke to his father, saying, kill my 2 sons. Now, I can't imagine saying this. Excuse me. But he says, kill my 2 sons. If I do not bring him back to you, put him in my hands, and I will bring him back to you. Because they realize if this famine doesn't end, they've got to go back and get more grain. But the condition was by this Lord of the land, if they didn't bring their youngest brother with them the next time, they would get no grain. Verse 38, but he, that is Jacob, said, my son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead. He too presumes Joseph is long since dead, and he is left alone. In other words, now Benjamin's alone because he was the only full brother of Joseph. And then continuing, if any calamity should befall him along the way in which you go, then you would bring down my gray hair with sorrow to the grave. You know, put simply, Jacob is saying, if I lose my youngest son as well, I'm going to die. The grief would be so great for me, I won't be able to handle it, and it'll kill me. So that ends this chapter 42. I think I'll just immediately continue right into the next chapter, verse 43. Now the famine was severe in the land, and I think that picture we looked at was pretty accurate. They just can't grow anything. Verse 2, and it came to pass when they had eaten up the grain which they had brought from Egypt, that their father said to them, Go back, buy us a little food. You've got to go back there and get some more grain. And it's an interesting shift here now. All of a sudden, Reuben is not the spokesman. Reuben, the oldest brother, the oldest son of Jacob, it shifts to Judah. He was the last of the first four sons born to Leah. If you remember that, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. And that's not strictly important for you to remember, but now Judah takes a leadership role. Verse 3, he spoke to him, to his father, and he said, The man, the Lord. And in other words, Joseph, which they don't know, but he said, The man solemnly warned us, saying, You shall not see my face unless your brother is with you. If you send our brother with us, we will go down and buy you food. But if you will not send him, we will not go down. For the man said to us, You shall not see my face unless your brother is with you. Now, clearly, Joseph's authority has had such an impact on them. They're not going to, they don't argue at all. They just know if we don't bring Benjamin, there is no hope of getting any more grain down there, and we're not even going to go. I think it's, lessons from the life of Joseph. This man had natural leadership capabilities, and clearly he had this natural authority, and they were totally convinced. Verse 6, and Israel. Now that's the same man. We find, remember when Jacob wrestled with the Lord, and at the end of that, the Lord himself said, Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, one who prevails with God, which is what that means. So it's simply a second name for Jacob, and it's used interchangeably here in this account. So Israel said, Why did you deal so wrongfully with me as to tell the man whether you still had another brother? So he's upset. Why did you even let this Lord down there in Egypt know that you had a younger brother back here? Well, verse 7, they said, apparently it's not just Judah, but the other nine are saying, The man asked us pointedly about ourselves and our family, saying, Is your father still alive? Have you another brother? And we told him according to these words. And then they defend themselves. Could we possibly have known that he would say, Bring your brother down? So it's a pretty good defense. And of course, Joseph was well aware they had a younger brother, but he had no idea if he's still living or not. So he's asking those pointed questions. But again, they didn't know who they were talking to. Let's go on to verse 8. Then Judah said to Israel his father, Send the lad with me, and we will arise and go, that we may live and not die. That's how serious it is. They're at risk of starving to death. And then continuing, he said, Both we and you, and also our little ones. In other words, we're all going to die. Our whole household here is not going to survive this. Sometimes I think the gravity of this escapes us. They truly were at the mercy of that store of grain down there in Egypt, which Joseph was in charge of. So let me continue here in verse 9. He says, this is Judah, I myself will be surety for him. From my hand you shall require him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then let me bear the blame forever. So this is quite a commitment as well. But verse 10, this seems pretty bold, but he said, "For if we had not lingered, surely by now we would have returned this second time." So I think this is telling us that Jacob or Israel stalled for quite a long time. He just couldn't bear to let Benjamin, his 12th and youngest son, to go down with them. But Judah said, if we hadn't, I don't think I'm, uh, assuming anything that's false here. He said, if we hadn't been haggling over this, if I could put it that way, we would have already been down there and would have returned the second time. Verse 11. Then their father Israel said to them, he relents now. He said, if it must be so, then do this. Take some of the best fruits of the land in your vessels and carry down a present for the man. A little balm and a little honey, spices and myrrh, pistachio nuts and almonds. Take double money in your hand and take back in your hands the money that was returned in the mouth of your sacks. Perhaps it was an oversight. So I'll pause there just a moment. There's something interesting in here. It is interesting that they still have a few stores of certain spices, honey, nuts, along with money. God had prospered Jacob's household greatly. Remember, we covered that in one of the earlier studies. And they still have that. That's wise. We're all told to be ready for the future. But they couldn't change the fact they couldn't raise any grain at all up there in Canaan, nor indeed in that whole region. So they're in dire straits, but they still have some stores here. I just thought as I was studying and reading this, it speaks well of Jacob and his household. They were planners, they had some things in store, but they don't have enough for survival. They also still have wealth. Paying for it is not a problem. It's just a matter of meeting the conditions that Joseph had laid out. Verse 13 is very interesting. Take your brother also. Jacob finally gives in. Take your brother also and arise, go back to the man. And may God Almighty give you mercy before the man, that he may release your other brother and Benjamin. But clearly, he doesn't have complete confidence that's going to happen because the verse ends, if I am bereaved, I am bereaved. They are in dire straits. I'll just repeat that once again. Let's go on, verses 15 through 17. So the men took that present and Benjamin, and they took double money in their hand and arose and went down to Egypt, and they stood before Joseph. Then Joseph saw Benjamin with them. Or excuse me, when Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he said to the steward of his house, take these men to my home and slaughter an animal and make ready, for these men will dine with me at noon. Then the man did as Joseph ordered, and the man brought the men into Joseph's house. So they arrived back down there in Egypt, and Joseph immediately orders some special preparations here for a meal. Now, we have to presume this was very, very unusual. There were people from other nations even coming to get grain, but to be invited or brought right into Joseph's house, that we presume would be very unusual. But of course, why is he doing that? The men, his brothers, are really worried about this. Verse 18. Verse 18. Now the men were afraid because they were brought into Joseph's house. And they said, it is because of the money which was returned in our sacks the first time that we are brought in, so that he may make a case against us and seize us and take us as slaves with our donkeys. Excuse me. In reality, it's a completely different reason that he wants to bring them into his house. But they think, uh-oh, now he's bringing us in here. We're going to be found guilty. We've been set up as thieves. We're going to be taken, and now they're not sure any of them will ever return to see their father again. Now, in verse 19, I'll read through a few verses here. In verse 19, when they drew near to the steward of Joseph's house, they talked with him. So this whole conversation now is with the steward. Um, they talked with him at the door of the house, and they said, "Oh, sir, we indeed came down the first time to buy food. But it happened when we came to the encampment that we opened our sacks, and there each man's money was in the mouth of his sack, our money in full weight." In other words, the entire amount of money that we brought was returned to us. So we have brought it back in our hand, and we have brought down other money in our hands to buy food. We do not know who put our money in our sacks. Verse 23, but he said, "Peace be with you. Do not be afraid. Your God and the God of your father has given you treasure in your sacks. I had your money." Then he brought Simeon out to them. So there's some interesting things here. They know that this steward is, he's close to Joseph. He's close to the Lord of the land. And so they're really pleading their case. And he's trying to comfort them. If you glance back at verse 23, don't be afraid. And it's interesting. I believe Joseph has had influence on this man because he said, your God and the God of your father has given you treasure. Even he seems to see God's hand in it. And it's interesting that Joseph has probably shared some of what he understood and what he believed with this man. Now, let's go on to verse 24. They actually go in the house now. Verse 24 and 25. So the man brought the men into Joseph's house and gave them water, and they washed their feet, and he gave their donkeys feed. You know, how many times, I've never counted, but how many times do we read this in the Bible? And it's very interesting as we're less than 4 weeks from the Passover now, this washing of feet. And I don't want to divert to that topic here too long, but you and I are going to be sitting down and washing another person's feet on Passover evening here, again, less than 4 weeks away. And that is so critically important. But here we're reading the tradition. And it was a strong tradition that went way, way, way back. When people walked, their feet got dirty. We presume they were not wearing shoes as you and I do. They wore sandals. And so it was a very common custom that water was provided and then they would wash their feet. Christ didn't just provide water, he washed his disciples' feet. He took a big step further. That gets into an incredibly important lesson of the Passover. But for now, I better go on this evening. Verse 25, so they made their present ready for Joseph's coming at noon, for they heard that they would eat bread there. So they find out they're actually going to have a meal with him. Now, in verse 26, when Joseph came home, they brought him the present that was in their hand into the house and bowed down before him to the earth. There's that dream coming true again. As much as they hated him for it, years and years earlier. Here it is coming true, except they still don't know it's their younger brother they're bowing before, but they fall down or bow before him to the earth. In verse 27, he asked them about their well-being and said, "Is your father well, the old man of whom you spoke? Is he still alive?" And they answered, "Your servant, our father, uh, is in good health. He is still alive." And they bowed their heads down and prostrated themselves. There again, the fulfillment of that dream. Verse 29 is quite a shift. Then he lifted his eyes. Joseph looks up, and he saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, and said, "Is this your younger brother of whom you spoke to me?" And he said, "God be gracious to you, my son. God be gracious to you, my son." Now, there's something quite interesting here. No, I think I'll stop right here. He turns his attention to Benjamin, who he hasn't seen since he was a small boy. Now, and I'll prove this here in a moment, it's now 22 years. Now, according to Ellicott's Bible commentary, Benjamin was but 8 or 9 years old when Joseph was sold into slavery. Kyle and Delitzsch, in their commentary, says he was 16 years younger. Well, if that's the case, and Joseph, we know, was only 17 when he was sold as a slave down to Egypt, little Benjamin would have been but 1 year old. So Joseph would have hardly recognized him. I think we can understand he would have recognized the older brothers, but think of the change of a little child, maybe as young as one, or maybe as old. Well, we really honestly don't know exactly how old he was, but maybe as old as 8 or 9. But think of the change if he's now in his 20s. So let me read on. He wants verification, I suppose, that this is his younger brother. Let me go back there, end of verse 29. He said, "God be gracious to you, my son." And then now his heart yearned for his brother. So Joseph made haste and sought somewhere to weep. He is so overcome with emotion that his only full brother, all the rest are half brothers, remember that. But now his full brother is before him, and he just can't take it. He is so emotionally overcome. So he made haste, sought somewhere to cry or weep, and he went into his chamber and wept there. Then he washed his face, and that's what you and I would do too if we didn't want to appear to have been crying. So he washed his face and came out, and he restrained himself, saying, "Serve the bread." So, verse 32, they set him a place by himself, and them by themselves, and the Egyptians who were with him by themselves, because the Egyptians would not eat food with the Hebrews, for that is an abomination to the Egyptians. And that's true. You can read about that in many commentaries. Egypt was a very prosperous land. They were, I think I could put it safely this way, they were arrogant people. And anyone else, just, to even eat with them was something they wouldn't do. And then there are other possibilities because of foods they ate and so forth. I don't have time to get into that. But there's two groups, and then Joseph. So there's three different places here. Joseph is seated by himself, perhaps, because of his authority. Then the Hebrew brothers are in one part of the room, and the Egyptians, part of his household's staff, we assume, were yet seated in a different place. Verse 34, then he took servings to them from before him. But Benjamin's serving was 5 times as much as any of theirs. So they drank and were merry with him. So, at least for a little bit of time here, they let down their guard and they're all pretty happy. I'm sure the meal was sumptuous. By the way, that phrase, his heart yearned for him or for Benjamin, the authorized version says his bowels did yearn for his brother. The New Living Translation says he was overcome with emotion. And so, the depth of this feeling, I think, is really hard to convey. Let's see. That that matter of this great portion being given to Benjamin. I was reading a little bit about that in commentaries. The large portion given to Benjamin was a token of great honor, and it was generally only done for a visiting dignitary. And yet he's the youngest of all of these brothers. But Joseph is clearly showing him favor. And they're going to find out later what all of this means. It's also very interesting. They were seated, it says, from the youngest according to, or the firstborn, according to his birthright, to the youngest. And we might want to think about that just a moment. How did he know? How did he know? Well, they're his brothers. But they must have begun to wonder, does this guy have, uh, you know, magical powers? Well, let's hurry on to chapter 44. He commanded the steward of his house, saying, fill the men's sacks with food as much as they can carry, and put each man's money in the mouth of his sack. So once again, he's being very generous. But he does something else. Verse 2, also put my cup, the silver cup, in the mouth of the sack of the youngest and his grain money. So he, or the steward, did according to the word that Joseph had spoken. And verse 3, as soon as the morning dawned, so it seems like they're only down there for a day, and then the very next morning, the men were sent away, they and their donkeys. Verse 4, when they had gone out of the city and were not yet far off, Joseph said to his steward. By the way, the New Living Translation renders that the palace manager. This is a person of high authority there in Joseph's household. But here's what he told him. Get up, follow the men, and when you overtake them, say to them, why have you repaid evil for good? Once again, he's going to put them through a stressful test. Verse 5, is not this the one from which my Lord drinks, in other words, this cup, and with which he indeed practices divination? You have done evil in so doing. So he's really setting them up once more for a trial that's going to cause them no end of stress. Verse 6, so he, that's the steward, overtook them, and he spoke to them these same words. Verse 7, they said to him, why does my Lord say these words? Far be it from us that your servant should do such a thing. Look, we brought back to you from the land of Canaan the money which we found in the mouth of our sacks. How then could we steal silver or gold from your Lord's house? With whomever of your servants it is found, let him die, and we also will be my Lord's slaves. Little do they know. They shouldn't have said that. That was reckless. Verse 10, the steward says, now also let it be according to your words. He with whom it is found, and it is this cup, shall be my slave, and you shall be blameless. Then each man speedily let down his sack to the ground, and each opened his sack. So he searched. He began with the oldest and left off with the youngest, and the cup was found in Benjamin's sack. Then, verse 13, they tore their clothes And each man loaded his donkey and returned to the city. And I'm sure at this point they feel they are doomed. Verse 14. So Judah and his brothers came to Joseph's house, and he was still there. And they fell before him on the ground. There's that dream fulfilled again. Their sheaves are really bowing to his sheaf. It's all being fulfilled. Verse 15, and Joseph said to them, what deed is this you have done? Did you not know that such a man as I can perfectly practice divination? Now, I need to I need to stop there. I want to comment about this. Here's a matter that deserves some discussion. This cup of divination. Maybe some of you read this in preparation, but I copied into my notes some things from our own Beyond Today Bible commentary. This is important. Here's a quote. Did Joseph really use the cup for prognostication or the interpretation of omens? That would surely not have been approved by God, and it certainly wouldn't. About the cup of divination, the Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown commentary remarks, divination by cups to ascertain the course of the future was one of the prevalent superstitions of ancient Egypt, as it is of Eastern countries still. It is not likely that Joseph, a pious believer in the true God, would have addicted himself to this superstitious practice. In other words, Joseph may have allowed them to think he practiced divination with his cup to instill more fear in them, as it would look to them like they would be changed, or excuse me, charged with the theft of something of great importance in Egypt. And that's true. I believe we can say with confidence, Joseph was not actually doing this. Now, did he have a silver cup? Yes. We don't doubt that. He's a wealthy man at this point, second in command over the entire nation of Egypt. But he was not using the cup in this way. But it was to his advantage here, once again, to teach them a lesson and to bring them back. And of course, it just adds to their stress, their worry. Verse 16, Judah said, what shall we say to my Lord? Once again, Judah is now the spokesman. They really have no defense. He said, what shall we say to my Lord? What shall we speak? Or how shall we clear ourselves? God has found out the iniquity of your servants. Here we are, my Lord's slaves, both we and he also with whom the cup was found. But verse 17, he said, now Judah's saying, we'll all be your slaves. But that's Joseph said in verse 17, far be it from me that I should do so. The man in whose hand the cup was found, he shall be my slave. And as for you, go up in peace to your fathers. So he's saying, 10 of you can go, but the youngest is going to stay with me. That really strikes fear into Judah's heart. In verse 18, Judah came near to him and he said, oh, my Lord, please let your servant speak a word in my Lord's hearing, and do not let your anger burn against your servant. For you are even like Pharaoh. He recognizes the authority that Joseph has. Verse 19, my Lord asked his servant, saying, have you a father or a brother? And we said to my Lord, we have a father, an old man, and a child of his old age who is young. His brother is dead. I just have to chuckle. They're standing before him, but they don't know that. They again have presumed that Joseph is long since dead. So they said, his brother is dead, and he alone is left of his mother's children. In other words, of the two children Rachel bore to Jacob, only one is left. And this is the younger brother. And his father loves him. Notice that, end of verse 20, his father loves him. Now, I think Jacob loved all his sons, but he had a very special love for the youngest Benjamin. Verse 21. Then you said to your servants, bring him down to me that I may set my eyes on him. And we said to my Lord, the lad cannot leave his father. For if he should leave his father would die. But you said to your servants, excuse me, unless your youngest brother comes down with you, you shall see my face no more. So he's rehearsing all of this, and I'll just continue reading without too much comment here, a few more verses. Verse 24. So it was when we went up to your servant, my father, that we told him the words of my Lord. And our father said, go back and buy us a little food. But we said, we cannot go down. If our youngest brother is with us, then we will go down. For we may not see the man's face unless our youngest brother is with us. Verse 27, then your servant, my father, said to us, you know what, or that my wife bore me two sons. And the one went out from me, and I said, surely he is torn to pieces, and I have not seen him since. But if you take this one also from me, and calamity befalls him, you shall bring down my gray hair with sorrow to the grave. So again, Judah's repeating, if we don't bring Benjamin back, the grief is going to be so great, Dad will die. Verse 30, now therefore, when I come to your servant my father, and the lad is not with us, since his life is bound up in the lad's life. This youngest, Benjamin, was so special to Jacob. They have this incredible bond. So it will happen when he sees that the lad is not with us, that he will die. So your servants will bring down the gray hair of your servant, our father, with sorrow to the grave. For your servant became surety for the lad to my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, then I shall bear the blame before my father forever. Now, therefore, please, here's his urgent plea. Please let your servant, in other words, let me remain instead of the lad, in other words, instead of Benjamin, as a slave to my Lord, and let the lad go up with his brothers. For how shall I go up to my father if the lad is not with me, lest perhaps I see the evil that would come upon my father? What he's really saying, lest I watch Dad die from all of this. Let me look at my watch. I've got a little time. I want to get into chapter 14. I'm reading rather quickly this evening, but I really want to read more. This is such a dramatic story. This is, to me, it's just incredible. You couldn't make up a novel any better than this. Let's go into chapter 45. Then Joseph could not restrain himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out. This is just too much for Joseph at this point. So we presume he speaks with a loud, commanding voice. Make everyone go out from me. So no one stood with him, while Joseph made himself known to his brothers. Here's where, in a sense, the drama reaches its peak. He must have had quite a contingent of staff there with him in his home, which was probably palatial, but he commands them to go out. Only his brothers are left there with him. He made himself known to his brothers. Verse 2, and he wept aloud. He's crying, perhaps almost uncontrollably, and the Egyptians and the house of Pharaoh heard it. So even though he had them leave his immediate presence there in the room, they still hear this. Verse 3, Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Does my father still live? Maybe he has a little bit of doubt that they're lying to him. We don't know, but why would he ask? But notice their reaction. But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed in his presence. They are still so worried about his retribution. They just can't come to grips with this that he's saying, I'm Joseph. I'm your brother. Verse 4, and Joseph said to his brothers, please come near to me. So they came near, and I think they're still doing this with a lot of trepidation. Then he said, he's repeating, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt, whom you sold, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. But now do not, therefore, be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. I'm here so that you can survive. Verse 6, for these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing or harvesting. Now, here's where I said earlier 22 years. They are only 2 years into the famine. There's yet 5. Think how bad this is. Verse 7, and God sent me before you. You see, Joseph still is reverent to God. He had been, remember, we covered this in an earlier study. He had been taught very well, we presume by his father, about God. That's why he said when Potiphar's wife was making her advances, how could I do this evil and sin against God? Remember that? This man's faith had sustained him, and his belief in God had sustained him for 22 years. But now he's going to be united with family. Verse 7, God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now, it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. I think this is just astounding. The position that this man has. He says he's even made me, he, that is God, has made me a father to Pharaoh. In a sense, he has authority over Pharaoh and the Lord of all his house. His authority is immense. And again, he repeats, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. I think we fail sometimes to understand the lofty position that Joseph had. Let me go on just a little bit more. Verse 9, hurry and go up to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Do not tarry. So they've got instructions to go back and get their dad, the aging Jacob, and bring him down there. Can you imagine how much Joseph longs to see him? Again, the emotion of all this, I think, is just hard to convey. And he's already, verse 10, he's already got a plan. He said, you shall dwell in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near to me, you and your children's children, your flocks and your herds, and all that you have. There I will provide for you, lest you and your household and all that you have come to poverty, for there are still 5 years of famine. And that's a place, I think, where I'll break off for this evening to keep this within about 1 hour. But before I stop recording, I want to go once more. I want to define 2 topics for discussion that I had sent out last night. Here are those 2 topics. What are some factors that enabled Joseph to come out of 13 years of being a servant slave and then a prisoner to become the highest official of a nation, second only to the king. What are some things that would enable a man, in this case Joseph, to come out of that rather ignominious life that he had lived for 13 years to be the highest official in the land, second only to Pharaoh? And the second question, because of the season that we're in right now and getting so close to, what are some parallels between the life of Joseph and his family and the lessons of the Passover that we are about to observe? Again, what are some parallels from the life of Joseph and the lessons of the Passover that we are about to observe? Because there are definitely some lessons there. With that, I will turn and stop the recording, and again, hope those of you who see this later will find it profitable.